I last introduced William Whyte's 1956 book, The Organization Man, and the cultural shift he outlined in America from the Protestant ethic, what he defines as the pursuit of individual salvation through hard work, thrift, and competitive struggle, to the social ethic, the belief in the group rather than the individual as the source of creativity, the belief in belongingness as the ultimate need of the individual, and the belief in the application of science to achieve that belongingness. Whyte describes this first ethic, or rather both ethics, as a mythology. In terms of the Protestant ethic, as he writes, people were never as separate from each other as the ideology suggested. In fact, people worked together quite well. In many cases, it was entirely necessary. And, although Whyte fights back against the use of the terminology conformity, it was clear that the social ethic had already become the dominant force in the 1950s, as demonstrated by the widespread conformity of the middle class to the organization, the singular term Whyte uses to denote both our ever-growing bureaucratic systems and our large corporations. But Whyte reiterates how, in years past, the old Protestant ethic did not match the realities of the America in which people had to live. And, although the executives of the corporate and bureaucratic world had consistently spoken highly of it, he had already begun to embrace an entirely contradictory ethic decades prior. As Whyte writes, let us go back a moment to the turn of the century. If we pick up the Protestant ethic as it was then expressed, we will find it apparently in full flower. We will also find, however, an ethic that had already been strained by reality. The country had changed, the ethic had not. Whyte indicates how the notion of a free system of governance had been reduced to the ideas of competition, money-making, and everyone's favorite Darwinian term, as developed by Herbert Spencer, survival of the fittest, and all with an especially perverted spin. If everyone could believe that seeking his self-interest automatically improves the lot of all, then the application of hard work should eventually produce a heaven on earth. In reality, however, as Whyte points out, it was not just the fittest, most determined, or hardest working who were successful in the age of the burgeoning organization, but those who had connections. It was not, as so many suggested, and as so many even continue to do so today, based on any form of merit. Neither, as banker Henry Clews spoke to students at Yale in 1908, as Whyte references, did intelligence rule worlds and systems of worlds. There was no natural order of nobility, but an entirely forced one, at least in terms of the supposed aforementioned values. And with the growth of the corporation, the bureaucratic system, and the associated attack on individualism, it had only become increasingly more difficult for the individual, by adherence to the Protestant ethic, to be successful in life. As an example, Whyte highlights how the old American value of thrift was becoming un-American. The same man who will quote from Benjamin Franklin on thrift would be horrified if consumers took these maxims to heart and started putting more money into savings and less into installment purchases. And, as Whyte adds, few talents are more commercially sought today than the knack for describing departures from the Protestant ethic as reaffirmations of it. More important to the middle managers, however, Whyte writes about how the management of old, which relied on self-reliance, was no more. It was the boardroom that began to rule through the committee way. The man of the future, as junior executives see him, is not the individualist, but the man who works through others for others. Whyte first prefers the term administrator, but what he is describing, more or less, is an increasingly collectivized and even bureaucratized management force, as we shall see. Interestingly, Whyte stops to address how the small business fits within such a system. Economically, many a small businessman is a counter-revolutionist, and the revolution he is fighting is that of the corporation as much as the new or fair deal. I do appreciate Whyte calling out federal policy here, however brief, and its negative implications for the small business. But he also calls attention to how the corporation man still clings to the idea that the small business and he are firm allies. And here, to my mind, lies a dynamic that has certainly changed over time. Just think of COVID-19 and the massive transfer in wealth from smaller businesses to larger corporations, with small businesses being required by law to remain closed, while larger corporations were able to keep going, being declared, as they were, by that same system of governance, essential. Where is there room for allyship between the small business and the large corporation here? Whyte also identifies a subset of intellectuals he believes were highly influential in regard to the rise in the social ethic and the attack on individualism and the Protestant ethic. While he addresses other intellectual figures on this account later, he points to the pragmatists here. Among these, he cites the father of American psychology, William James, philosopher and educator, John Dewey, historian, Charles Beard, and economist and sociologist, Thorstein Veblen. As Whyte writes, they were not rebels against society. What they fought was the denial of society's power, and they provided an intellectual framework that would complement, rather than inhibit, the further growth of the organization. Although he cautions his reader against entirely blaming such figures for subverting the American temperament, he emphasizes how pragmatism, ethical relativism, Freudianism, and other such developments have contributed much to the social ethic, and stresses how these figures should be criticized regardless, as many of their presuppositions are as shaky as those they replaced. As I am wont to do, I cannot help but point back to Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. I passed over the fact in my initial examination of the work in favor of looking at Freudianism that Carnegie consistently highlights the work of William James, and I will have to explore this topic in the future. But looking at pragmatism, Whyte adds, pragmatism's emphasis on the social and the practical, furthermore, was thoroughly in the American tradition. From the beginning, Americans had always been impatient with doctrines and systems. Like the Puritans, many came here because of doctrine, but what they came to was a new environment that required some powerful adapting to. And whenever the doctrine got in the way of practicality, the doctrine lost out. Few people have had such a genius for bending ideals to the demands of the time, and the construction of fundamental theory, theological or scientific, has never excited Americans overmuch. I also think this helps underscore the need to avoid reducing American history, or even the American present, to highly theoretical terms, especially outdated ones such as individualism, democracy, capitalism, and the like. In a sense, they are old-world terms, and people often misunderstand their historical connotation. They most certainly do not describe the entirety of our current system, which has grown to be, at least in part, increasingly dominated by the organization. That being said, it is important to stress having some element of individualism in our culture. Individualism in the traditional sense. And this is just what Whyte does. If the group or organization comes first, it is the individual who does not blindly conform that will be sacrificed first for the supposed greater good. Yet society needs such individuals if it is going to thrive. It is also important to understand the limits of individualism. Indeed, it is rather obvious that the individual does need a sense of belongingness as well, and the supposed individualism of today that leaves the man and woman isolated and alienated from society is entirely inadequate. But as Whyte continues, referring again to the realities of the turn of the 19th to 20th century, by the time of the First World War, the Protestant ethic had taken a shellacking from which it would never recover. Rugged individualism and hard work had done wonders for the people to whom God, in his infinite wisdom, as one put it, had given control of society, but it hadn't done so well for everyone else, and now they, as well as the intellectuals, were all too aware of the fact. And again, thus we get the rise of the social ethic. But it is with this same new ethic, as described by Whyte, that has led, over time I believe, to the same alienation and isolation that people often associate with the term individualism today. It has been a kind of corporate collectivism that has actually taken over, and it seems as if we have even fewer real opportunities today than were had during the time in which the Protestant ethic was still dominant, or at least the time in which people still felt impelled to acknowledge its values, even if only hypocritically. And while the middle class was still growing when Whyte was writing The Organization Man, over time it would seem that the very values that same middle class embraced investing their own lives and their children's lives, as they did, in the organization, have led to a serious reduction in the middle class today. As I cited Whyte last time, these people thought bureaucratic bodies and large corporations had their best interests in mind. Again, as Whyte continues, emphasis on the social became the dominant current of U.S. thought. In a great outburst of curiosity, people became fascinated with the discovering of all the environment pressures on the individual that previous philosophies had denied. As with Freud's discoveries, the findings of such inquiries were deeply disillusioning at first. But with characteristic exuberance, Americans found a rainbow. Men might not be perfectible after all, but there was another dream, and now at least it seemed practical: the perfectibility of society. Perhaps it is in the realm of circular reasoning, but it seems, given how such utopian dreams had always already ended before, up to that time, Americans should have realized that such outbursts and exuberances in perfectibility would lead to terrible outcomes. But more on the perfectibility of society next time, when I will pick back up with scientism, or what Whyte refers to as the practical part of the social ethic. I hope to see you there.